Wonderful. Welcome. Those of you joining us here, we'll give folks a few more minutes to join in. I see some familiar names and faces. Hi, Ken. Hi, Dr. Quinlan. I'm not sure if we've met yet, but it's great to meet you. I think we've met via email.
Nice to meet you.
Wonderful. I think we're going to have a Lab Exchange crew here. Did I invite too many Lab Exchange folks to join us here tonight? Welcome. Great. For those of you just joining us here this evening, we are waiting a few more minutes for folks to kind of trickle in from the waiting room. And just as a note, this is being recorded just for your awareness and your consent. So by continuing to stay on this call, you're giving us your consent to record you. Great. I'll give it one more minute. And I think we can get started. All right. Well, I want to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time that's already has joined us. So I want to welcome you to one of our first webinar series to promote the Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science Education project. Our title for this evening is Addressing Race, Health, and Science in the Classroom. So I want to welcome you all here this evening or afternoon, wherever you're joining us here today. As a bit of an icebreaker, and as folks continue to join us, I want to get to know who has joined us today. So in the chat, if you don't mind putting in a little response here about what your role is in education, where are you joining us from today, and what are you hoping to get out of this webinar? Is there something in particular that you're curious about? Any lingering, dying questions you want us to answer? Just let us know, and we'll see it in the chat here. Wonderful, welcome. Welcome, Ruth. Great to see you. Does anyone else want to introduce themselves? I also respect if you don't want to, that's okay. Especially if it's been a long day. I've been there. Especially you're joining after hopefully a good work day and it's the evening. So thank you all. Rob, welcome. Oh, one of our collaborators. Wonderful to see that. Thank you for joining us from PG Ed. Welcome, Ken. Well, thank you so much for being here this evening. Before we dive too much further into this project, I want to have us introduce ourselves. So there's two of us presenting here tonight. I will let Udodiri introduce yourself first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Udodiri Okwandu. I just earned my PhD from the History of Science department at Harvard University, literally 2 weeks ago, so it's very recent. Yeah. And I've been working with LabXchange for about, I think I started in 2021, around that on the cluster that we'll be discussing today. I've lent my expertise in the history of racial, gender, and class disparities in medicine and science to this project, and really excited to share a little bit with you all today and support Nicole.
Absolutely. And again, congratulations. You're fresh off the graduation ceremony, and we're delighted to have you here to share your part of your story about this this project. And a little bit about myself. the one who's been talking the most. My name is Nicole Sjoblom. I am the relationship manager here at LabXchange. I am a trained scientist, but certainly a strong advocate for diversity in STEM and a ton of experience within K through 12, but also undergraduate and graduate education, and utilizing inclusive pedagogy. So certainly bringing in a diverse wealth of experience from the science education side of things. So I think together, we combining forces, this will be a great talk for you all here tonight. So our agenda. So again, thinking about this title of addressing race, health, and science in the classroom, we'll first be discussing what this project is, and then briefly about the overarching initiative, and then the smaller project or sub-project, excuse me, of racism as a public health crisis. Then we'll be discussing a lot of more why this is important. Why should we be discussing this in the classroom, especially in a health or science setting? And then lastly, tying into how we can actually integrate it, start to think about bringing this into these classroom spaces. So that's our agenda for this evening. So first, for those of you that aren't familiar with LabXchange, I think a lot of you hopefully are based on being here this evening. But for those of you that don't know, LabXchange is a global science classroom open to every curious mind. So it's housed here at Harvard University with initial funding from the Amgen Foundation. And we really pride ourselves in creating high quality content, making sure it's accessible for educators and learners around the globe. And so we create content ourselves, but we also work with a number of great collaborators to really build out this platform for these high quality resources. And this is all free, and we're really grateful, especially for our funding from the Amgen Foundation that continues to support this platform even today. So RDEISE, as I might call it, is the Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science Education initiative here at LabXchange. So this project was started, I think, back in 2020, and we've worked with some tremendous scholars and experts, one joining us here this evening to help learners to identify and transform these structures that perpetuate this racial inequity in healthcare, education, and STEM across the US. And it's really forcing or allowing students to really challenge this perception that science is really independent of these social issues, but rather bringing this all together to create this inclusive and accessible science education. And there are two main clusters of resources that we have developed or are developing within this initiative. The first of which is racism as a public health crisis. This cluster of resources is aimed at high school and college learners, and it explores the concept of race in the context of science, medicine, and public health. And the second of which is actually still is in development, is advancing equity in STEM through inclusive teaching strategies. Excuse that typo there. That it was developed for educators, and the goal is really to empower teachers to foster that sense of belonging and identity within STEM. So today we'll be focusing on that first grouping of resources, or cluster as we call it, racism as a public health crisis. And certainly if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat as we're talking. So this first cluster of resources, or grouping of resources as we call it, has 7 different learning pathways. And these pathways are an incredible place to start, especially as an educator, as to guide a specific topic or conversation regarding a specific subject. So the first of this is how can we begin to understand race? The second, how can we begin to understand human genetic diversity? The third, racism and the history of science. Has some incredible stories in that pathway. What role should race have in medicine? What are health disparities and what causes them? How racism influences social and environmental determinants of health, and working towards health equity. So combined within this cluster, within this cluster, there are plenty of resources and things that we'll be discussing here today. So again, these incredible resources have such unique topics to kind of, and driving questions to really push that conversation forward. So what makes these resources unique for learners? I think there's a few things that we'll be discussing that ties into this project in particular. The first is that it's interdisciplinary. It was designed with that intention to connect race with science and medicine and really to acknowledge and amend these effects of racism, and also designed for an integration in a variety of classroom settings. So again, this isn't something that is very specific for one class, one course, or one curriculum. There are a lot of different pieces that we'll talk about in a little bit that can really dive into many different topics. The second, and this is really standard, I think, of LabXchange as a whole, but certainly within this project, it is inclusive and accessible. So by inclusivity, we're really treating the audience as open to learning about race and science. You'll notice perhaps in some of the designs of the graphics or the videos or many other parts of these resources that have been created. I'm thinking about people that might be visually impaired, thinking about adding captions in those videos, and of course, that accessibility is WCAG, so accessibly designed in its production. The third is really that it's cutting edge, it's new, it's interactive, it's really bringing a lot of great resources to allow students to develop this critical thinking, build that empathy, and allow them to explore at their own pace, and allowing students to really engage in it in I think, a very mindful manner. So certainly it's not just a big body of text. There are great videos. There are these interactive components, one of which I will highlight here. So interactive infographics, and we've got a kind of simulation on the screen here. So interactive infographics are something that were created specifically for this project. And these are simulated environments with these interactive or clickable hotspots. You can kind of see the cursor moving around. And by clicking on the content and resources, something else will unlock and allow the learners to engage again and explore and unlock these new scenes based on their own pace and on their own interests. And I will add, these are also mobile compatible. We know that many learners don't necessarily learn on their laptops, so these are compatible on your phone as well. So these are just some of the reasons why these resources are really unique for learners. And that leads me to think about, again, what the content is and why it really is important to bring these into the classroom. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Udodiri to talk about why it's important to discuss these topics in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you so much. So why should we discuss race in the science classroom? I'm going to be going over three main reasons, but before I kind of dive into that, it's indisputable that, the medical and scientific enterprise have produced immense advances. However, just because science and medicine work, that doesn't mean that we can't also interrogate and challenge the authority granted to it and understand the ways in which it can also serve to shape the world in perhaps more challenging or less beneficial ways. I think this really becomes relevant when we begin to think about the relationship between scientific and medical knowledge production and particular identity markers, race being one of them, but, we could probably create a whole segment on the relationship between science and gender and sexuality, science and gender and class, science, gender, and religion. Our project has really focused on race as one significant aspect of difference. And the ways in which seemingly objective scientific and medical perspectives can also serve to perpetuate inequity within our society. And I think there's a range of contemporary phenomena that can point to this, right? That have scientific and medical roots, right? There's been increased attention to the ways in which clinical algorithms used within medical contexts can produce differential health outcomes. One of the key ones is the spirometer. From seemingly mundane things such as automatic soap dispensers, which have been found to not be able to recognize darker skin tones. So it really makes us kind of think about who is the imagined subject when we're kind of engaging in these engineering sorts of enterprises. The COVID-19 pandemic, I think, really perpetuated and revealed biases that kind of persist in the medical system. From vaccine access to the way medications are being designed, to biases within the healthcare system. And there's been really also increased attention to the ways in which biases can persist algorithmic searches, search engines such as Google. And I think these questions are even being raised even more with the rise of artificial intelligence and things such as ChatGPT. What is the information that's being fed into these algorithms? And so the urgency to really think about, race as a component of difference and how we can really push students to think more critically about, what is race? And I could go on a whole lecture on what is race, but that's not the point of today. But I think the goal of this project is to really think about the fact that race is not a static category, right? But it's something that has been produced over time. That has, created kind of hierarchies of difference between subjects, how it embeds itself within commonly seemingly objective sort of scientific and medical practice, and how can we kind of untangle these perspectives. And so one of the first main points that we really think about is that it provides a means to contextualize scientific innovations and discoveries. So first, we want students to think about, how and identify and address biases in research and innovation, which can ultimately serve to promote equity, right? So kind of thinking about, interrogating really this idea of neutrality. And what sorts of internal biases or ideas about particular groups might be shaping work and investigations. It also exposes students to ethical dilemmas that have emerged in healthcare and science. I think one that we often talk about within my field is, ethical biomedical research and our relationships with subjects, right? And I think looking at it from a historical perspective, we can look at how particularly before the mid-20th century, the most vulnerable subject within our nation, often racial and ethnic groups, those within carceral settings, have often served as the backbone of these innovations, but have largely and often been exploited within these contexts. And I think it also helps students recognize the ethical implications of their work and encourages more responsible and socially conscious scientific practices. I think it really facilitates self-reflection. And I think one of the most rewarding thing that I've seen in my own teaching of particularly STEM students who come into my courses is that they really start to question this idea of everything that comes out of this realm is objective. It really, I think, humanizes science education and its practical implications. So I think next slide.
Yep. Perfect.
And I think related to that, I think once you have a deeper understanding of this history and its implications, students begin to foster more empathy and begin to think more critically about the long-term ramifications of the work that they're doing, which I think is really important. Again, for example, we're seeing this with things like this with artificial intelligence. I'm sure we can probably do more there. But I think we want to really push students to think about what are the long-term implications of the work that I do, and how can we better produce work that takes into consideration those who are often most vulnerable and might have less of a voice within these spaces. So when they're approaching problem solving, they're approaching it with a more inclusive and empathetic mindset. I think it also pushes students to think about and consider more diverse perspectives. Again, thinking about who might be more vulnerable, or thinking about who has often been excluded from these discourses and why. And I think it also finally allows them to be more responsible and engage in more ethical decision making when they pursue their intellectual work. And finally, it can also help students examine and understand contributions from diverse racial backgrounds. I think oftentimes, there's so much progress that has been made within the STEM space, but there's still so much more that we can do. A range of racial and ethnic minorities, particularly Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous individuals remain underrepresented within STEM. Women continue to be underrepresented in STEM. And when we intersect gender and race, we begin to see even less representation within these spaces. And so I think this is particularly important when we think about, high school learners. So many studies have shown how much important visibility and mentorship is for students to continue to feel motivated to pursue STEM careers. And so I think when we think about the range of contributions from diverse actors, we're not only showing students that they are able, they can imagine themselves in that position, but also exposing them to a wide range of intellectual work that is sure to enrich their own future work. And so again, it helps them appreciate the importance of diversity and inclusion for the advancement of STEM. Again, inspiration and confidence for themselves to persist on these paths. And it allows them to acknowledge the diverse lived experience of their peers within the classroom. Because I think at the end of the day, science, STEM is a collective enterprise. And we want it to be a space in which a diverse range of actors get to work together, collaborate to push the field forward.
Absolutely. I think those are some incredible points to consider. And certainly, as we're talking about bringing it to the classroom, we know it's not an easy feat. And there are certainly some barriers to that, but there are certainly so many key points for this consideration, bringing it to the forefront of the space. To break up our presentation just a little bit, and again, I think to reiterate just the real importance of the stories and the inequities that really are facing, in this case, Black women today. I have a little pop quiz here for you all to make sure you guys are all listening. So curious if anyone knows the answer to this question. So according to the Center for Disease Control, Black women are how many times more likely to die of pregnancy-related complications compared to white women? All right, 6 times, Rob says. Any other guesses? 3 to 4? Anyone? 3 times? Yeah, so the answer is 3 to 4, 3 to 4 times. So it seems like to probably knew exactly what it was. And I think again, this is just really representative of just like the current issues that are facing not only women in health, but Black women in health, especially. And I think especially diving into some of these resources within this pathway, it's just certainly eye-opening to really see and learn about the history of modern gynecology as one example that was discussed in these resources. And so certainly it's just, especially as someone who's expecting herself, certainly just something to really consider in terms of that and that awareness that Udodiri was just talking about. So this content or cluster of resources that we've been talking about, as we said, it's really bringing some great, incredible topics to the classroom for students to learn, and actually potentially even educators as well for themselves to learn and feel more confident to be able to discuss these topics with their students. I think that's another important piece of information to consider. So as I kind of have alluded to, I wanted to further define this within LabXchange, how we define these assets or resources. So the first of which is a resource. So singularly, it's a piece of content like a video, a text, and interactive. The pathway, those 7 pathways that I shared earlier, are kind of like a playlist. You could think of YouTube or Spotify, a playlist of curated guided content, excuse me, through this journey. And then a cluster is this grouping of pathways. So thinking about this RDEISE project, what are some ways that these specific pieces could be integrated within the classroom? The first of which is to really just a singular resource, singular asset that can help explain new concepts or strengthen new material. So something that you could bring into the classroom as a pre-reading or a pre-watch assignment or interactive that students engage with before a classroom period, or perhaps after the fact, or something that you integrate like a video throughout the classroom. So it really is, or the class period, excuse me. So it really is just a great place to start, especially if there's a specific topic or subject that you're hoping to cover. A pathway is certainly a place to start, and you can modify it, and I'll talk about that in the next slide for your students. I think a pathway, which tends to have at least, I think, 8 to 12 different resources, is certainly a place to start for thinking about homework assignments, individual learning, whether it's during the class period or after the fact as well, and they can be modified for your own students' needs. So that personalization can certainly come into play. As we say at LabXchange, you certainly know your students better than we would. So certainly we want to make sure that you're able to personalize it or modify it for them. And then the last piece, that cluster component. So this is a place where it's almost great to start for a curriculum or larger course-based materials. So if you're thinking about starting a course or a larger perhaps unit within your classroom setting, or the cluster is a great place to start with if you're starting to develop or design those materials. So here's a screenshot of what one of our pathways look like. In particular, this is one of the latest to be launched from this Racism as a Public Health Crisis cluster. So this is working towards health equity. So this screen grab here, so you can see the variety of resources that we have kind of built in, kind of number one, number two, and so on. So you can see this one has a video first in the pathway, followed by an interactive. Unfortunately, it got cut off, so we're not listing all of them. But two different ways that you can think about, as I said, with that personalization would be to edit or modify this pathway. So again, if you like some of these videos or some of these things, these resources, but you think, oh, I want to add your own resources or think about some other things that are in our library, you can certainly copy or edit this pathway in that way. And then I won't talk much about this today, but certainly folks can follow up with me if they have questions about it, about assigning pathways to specific classes. So there is a kind of classroom learning management system feature of LabXchange. So it's a great way to add it to a specific class to assign it to your students in that capacity. All right. So as I said, this really is interdisciplinary content that could be applied and driven into a number of different courses. So I have a list here. We're going to go through specific topics. I didn't hear one person say they were specifically teaching one topic or another. So this will just kind of be a broad overview of ways that, again, that this RDEISE racism as a public health crisis content could be utilized. So first, thinking about anthropology, I recognize that anthropology is probably more of a college level course, perhaps not necessarily a high school level course. If it is, might be amongst AP biology. But if you're thinking about conversations about understanding race and ethnicity, race and racism, exploring that diversity in societies, cultural evolution, genetics and evolution, and perhaps those are intertwined. There are a handful of many resources, but I just pulled out a select few here. The first of which is why humans do not have a biological race. I think that's a fantastic overview of that question. How have our understandings of race changed over time, which is an interactive. So a different interactive, I believe, than the one I shared with you earlier. But again, it's allowing students to engage and learn at their own pace. And the last, which I think is actually a pretty popular one, what can at-home DNA testing tell us about race and ancestry? And these are from the How Can We Begin to Understand Race pathway. All of these resources, I think, are incredible and aligned to those topics that I just mentioned. But I think broad strokes, even if you're not teaching the anthropology course, but you want to understand race or again, continue to bring the topic or conversation of race into your classroom, I think these are just incredible resources to start those conversations with students and better prepare yourself as well. Great. Next up is biology. So as a biochemist by training, this certainly is near and dear to my heart. So the topics or standards that might align to biology that you could think about thinking about NGSS or the next generation science standards, so kind of a more national standards, or thinking about inheritance and variation of traits, biological evolution, natural selection and evolution, and again, think AP biology, genetics, and evolution. So a few resources that tie into biology to think about would be the evolution of human hair, which is an interactive. Human genetic diversity is discordant, so really inherited separately. All these just different traits are inherited separately. And the story of Henrietta Lacks, uncovering the HeLa cells. If you're not familiar with that story of Henrietta Lacks, it is, I say indescribable, but of course we described it in a text asset. But it really is incredible. The history behind the development of the cell line itself, the contributions to science, but the unfortunate and ill-ethical considerations that occurred with the collection of those cells. And so these are from two different pathways within this cluster here. How can we begin to understand human diversity and racism in the history of science? And that pathway, racism and the history of science, I think is just an incredible pathway in general to think about and understand. Like, I kind of do you probably your dissertation, right? But like, how the history of science is really interwoven with racism and some horrible stories, but also some incredible things that have come out of it. Next up was environmental studies. This perhaps tying into the high school standards, thinking about Earth and human activity, Earth and space science, again, aligning with middle or high school and GSS standards, human impact on the environment, as well as any topic tied into global change, or excuse me, climate change or global warming, as well as environmental impacts on public health. So a few resources that I've selected here. Again, there's just so many that really tie into a lot of these different topics, but I wanted to select a few here. The first of which is who does pollution affect the most? Who is affected by climate change, and how racism magnified the effects of Hurricane Katrina. And these were from the pathway, how racism influences social and environmental determinants of health. All right. Second to last topic, excuse me, course I wanted to discuss is public health. I think that certainly as public health is in this was in this cluster title, there's a lot that ties into it. Certainly public health is more, I think, of an advanced topic, more for the collegiate level, but some certain topics that tie into it and subjects would be health inequities or disparities, working towards health equity, behavioral and policy interventions, understanding those determinants of health, and a few resources that tie into it would be what causes racial health disparities, how living in an underserved community affects your health. And that actually is a video from one of the writers or fellows that worked on this project, from their story, which I found very heartbreaking to hear about their family's health and kind of how it impacted them living in the community that they did. And then why should we care about health inequity? And that's an interactive. So there's so many things. So these are from the pathways. What are health disparities and what causes them? And working towards health equity, those pathways. And last but not least would be medicine. So for thinking about medicine, again, this is a more advanced topic, but certainly anyone that's within medical research or practice, someone studying medical ethics, bioethics, or so on. These resources I think are great in a pre-medical setting. So if there's any students perhaps in the high school setting that are interested in medicine, or kind of wrapping up their four-year degree and thinking about transitioning to medical school. And the last bullet point I had here, I actually just found these really fascinating, these resources for consideration for my own personal medical care. So I think we're all learners, and we certainly welcome learners of all ages and on the platform. And these resources that I selected here were how racialized medicine affects health outcomes, the legacy of slavery and modern gynecology, and culturally competent care in action. So these are from a few different pathways here on the platform. I think I mentioned most of them, perhaps, but the last one that I showed you earlier was working towards health equity. So kind of understanding, again, that history of where we were and kind of what has happened, why it's important, and then working towards that health equity. So in order to access all of these resources, certainly on LabXchange it's free to use, free to access. We welcome and encourage folks to create an account that allows you to have a personal dashboard for you to organize and share some of your favorite content. You can create, customize, and optimize your learning experience for your students. If you have not created an account already, I really encourage you to do so. Please go to labexchange.org/sign-up, and you'll be able to, thank you, I think Ileana is here, put that in the chat, to be able to create your own account. All of this is free to access. You don't necessarily need an account, but for better integration within your classroom setting, it certainly is a great thing to do. All right. So to kind of wrap up our conversation, and we certainly have time for questions here, I really want to conclude with those few points, driving back to our agenda earlier that I discussed. The first of which is that these resources from the RDEISE project, and in particular, the Racism as a Public Health Crisis, is a grouping of accessible, interactive, and interdisciplinary resources for students that really explores this idea of race in the context of science, medicine, and health. As Udodiri talked about earlier, integration is vitally important to contextualize these discoveries, examine these biases, and develop an inclusive mindset to really transform these inequities within STEM I think, within the development of any kind of science medical discoveries that occur. And then lastly, that these resources do align with a variety of different topics that we just discussed, as well as those standards that many of those courses require in the middle school and high school setting to create these inclusive opportunities for students. With that, we will pause here. If there are any other questions that we can't answer, or that, excuse me, that we can answer, not can't, that we can answer, and certainly encourage you to reach out to us if there are any further questions that you want to speak to us directly. So I will stop talking here and open up the chat, or if you're more comfortable, you're welcome to unmute yourself to ask away. Yes, Rob, thank you.
Hi, great presentation. Something that we have in our program, also at Harvard, have run into, and also that I've run into in my other engagement, is teachers having very real concerns, having an interest in doing this work, integrating, concerns about health equity, racism, ableism, other issues into their classrooms, but very understandably being concerned that this will open them up to professional attacks, maybe concerned about lack of support from administration. I'm just wondering what any advice you might give to people navigating that, and also, I guess, at maybe a higher level, like what responsibility do we have as people who are trying to,
Yeah.
encourage curriculum change for providing some support and guidance in that space? Thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Multiple questions. Good questions there. Udodiri, did you have any responses to those? I want to open it up to you first.
Yeah, no, I have a few thoughts. I mean, it's a really important question. I think we're in a really intense landscape. I think that's a kind way of saying it. I mean, there are literally states in this country where I think you can be legally penalized for doing so. And so of course, I think at the end of the day, teachers, I mean, I don't want to say, I understand if teachers in particular states don't want to break the law to integrate these sorts of this sort of content. It's unfortunate that it's reached this point. But I do think in spaces in which it is a possibility and there's not any sort of like legal restrictions, I do think perhaps it's worth meeting. I think there's power in numbers. I think perhaps if there's any sorts of collaborations that can be fostered across a range of educators within a particular space, whether it's like within the science space or within, I mean, yeah, we're looking at STEM educators here, which could at least create some sort of consistency across the curriculum. I think it doesn't hurt to bring this up with, the higher ups that be you in whatever context you're in, to, assert that it's within your right to integrate the sort of content within the teaching space, but of course wanting to do that with their own support. I know other things that some spaces have done that I've heard people do is make it an optional part of the curriculum. So, they'll have maybe mandatory components of assignments or modules or readings that students have to do, and then they'll incorporate, I'll say identity-based curriculum as an optional component that's like listed on the syllabus, but students who are curious or interested can, opt in. That way you can kind of, lay to rest any sort of indoctrination claims that might come up. But I certainly sympathize, and I think about this a lot myself as I'm entering postgraduate life about the landscape that we're in. And these are just some of my preliminary ideas or thoughts on the matter.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think to add to that, from other teachers that I've heard that I think have similar concerns, it's certainly for themselves feeling, again, confident in the material and having that support from their administration is key. And being able to bring it to their administration and kind of say, I plan on doing this, and kind of getting that support. I think having that in case there is, I'm thinking of in the high school setting, perhaps some parental backlash that may happen, to know that you have some people in your corner, right? In your corner to support you if something does come up. Something else to consider, I think, also is not published yet, but the second cluster of resources that's for educators, I think will tie into and have a lot of great information for educators as well that are considering integrating these kinds of conversations into their coursework as well. So while it's not publicly available just yet, we could certainly support folks and I think work with you, Rob, if you have any other questions, because I think it's certainly, as Udodiri said, a fight with numbers, and certainly by collaborating with other organizations, we could be able to do that. Yes, absolutely. And working, yes, as Rob just put in the chat here, we're thinking about informal science learning spaces as well. I believe I was talking to someone that had mentioned was it in Florida, that actually a lot of churches are kind of diving into these conversations as well. Was there another question or hand raised? Yes, Catherine. Would you like to add to that? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure.
Absolutely.
I can add to that, but I guess what I was also thinking when you said that, because I'm also, being a parent and a concerned parent, we do want to know what's being shared with our children as well. I'm just wondering, I'm really curious as to people's experience, especially places like Florida and Texas. And I guess I also picture, the LabXchange resources being great for an exploration, that allows students to, independently, we can communicate with parents at home, so that they could have a say in it if they wanted to, even explore it themselves, right?
Yeah.
They could be active participants. I guess that's something that I also picture. Getting them involved and showing them that, hey, I'm not trying to coerce, I'm just giving them these resources, and perhaps you can decide what you want your child to explore, right? And if you don't like them, suggest something else. How's that?
I like that approach. I think certainly I know today, especially, a lot of parents are being intentionally or unintentionally added to these conversations about, what's being discussed in the classroom. And I think that's a great point. These are open for learners of any age. And that's a great
Right.
point.
Yeah, because sometimes even, the well-intended can, lead to other perceptions, right? That you weren't intending. But my question was, I don't know if you were able to see, with whatever it is, Google Analytics or your website analytics. I'm so curious as to if you can tell who uses the equity resources more, which states. I'm just curious about that.
That's a great question. I don't know if we have it just yet. We're certainly building out those analytics. Also, just added to the platform, we added surveys at the end of each of the pathways. So hopefully folks are giving us their honest feedback, and we did ask where they're located as well. So we get a somewhat of a geographical understanding as well. So not yet, but certainly we're excited to know that information as well.
Awesome, thanks.
Great question. So any other questions or points to make as we kind of wrap up this conversation here today? And as we wrap up, I'll just add, I think this is not like this is the end of this conversation by any means. I think this is just the start of these kind of conversations. So I certainly welcome you to reach out to myself. My email is there. Udodiri added her own email. She'll be starting, I think she said, at Rutgers soon. So she'll have a new email as well, which we're excited for her on that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we certainly welcome your questions, feedback, any other learnings that you want to bring to this conversation. Again, this is just a starting place for us, and we plan on having some more conversations about these resources, probably more in depth on specific topics, as well as thinking about, to Rob's point, the educator community as we move forward. So if there are no other questions, I want to thank you so much for your time this evening, Udodiri, for joining me this evening, and all of you that are here tonight. This is being recorded, and so certainly we will have this recording available for you all to share with your networks, and for those of you that were not able to join us here tonight. All right. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your week. Hopefully we'll talk to you all soon.